Mobile Task Forces. Mobile Task Forces, MTFs, are elite units comprised of personnel drawn from across the Foundation and are mobilized to deal with specific threats or situations that sometimes exceed the operational capacity or expertise of regular field personnel and, as their name suggests, may be relocated between facilities or locations as they are needed. Mobile Task Force personnel represent the best of the Foundation. Mobile task forces vary greatly in size, composition, and purpose. A battalion-strength combat-oriented task force trained to deal with highly aggressive anomalous entities may consist of hundreds of troops plus support personnel, vehicles, and equipment and can be deployed in whole or in part to deal with threats across the globe. However, a mobile task force can also be a small, specialized intelligence gathering or investigative task force that may have fewer than a dozen personnel if that is deemed sufficient to accomplish their goals. While in the field, task force members often pose as emergency responders, local or federal law enforcement, or military personnel appropriate to the region in which they are operating. Mobile Task Force commanders can also request the assistance of local field units or personnel stationed at nearby Foundation facilities in order to accomplish their missions. Organization. Each unit is fundamentally structured in a way that best suits their intended purpose. While combat-oriented task forces may closely follow military hierarchy and organization, smaller units may have an informal or otherwise esoteric chain of command. As such, the responsibilities of the Mobile Task Force Commander, MTFC, for each particular task force can vary greatly. The commander for a large task force might focus on maintaining multiple teams and deploying them as necessary to each assigned operation, whereas the commander of a small team might deploy with their team and direct the operation from on location. Similarly, the cohesion of each unit will vary as well. Some mobile task forces consist of personnel who have trained and worked for many years or even decades together, whereas the personnel of a mobile task force formed on a moment's notice to deal with a specific incident may know little more than each other's names and fields of expertise. Creation. Mobile task forces are typically commissioned as deemed necessary by the Foundation's Director of Task Forces, often with the direct approval of one or more O5 Council members. A significant number of mobile task forces are created to deal with specific anomalies exhibiting traits that standard containment or response teams are unable to effectively counteract, though many were also created to pre-empt an emerging or theoretical threat. Deactivation. Mobile task forces created for the purpose of containing a particular anomaly are typically deactivated at the end of the recovery operation or when ongoing containment is deemed no longer necessary. Occasionally, such task forces remain operational if the expertise and experiences learned are considered useful for future incidents, but otherwise the task force will likely be disbanded and its personnel returned to their prior posts. Very rarely, a mobile task force will also be disbanded if it suffers sufficient casualties to render it incapable of operation. In these cases, if the prior capability of that particular task force is deemed necessary, a new task force may be commissioned to replace it. Table of Contents. MTF Alpha 1, Red Right Hand. MTF Alpha 4, Pony Express. MTF Alpha 9, Last Hope. MTF Beta 4, Castaways. MTF Beta 7, Mazhatters. MTF Gamma 5, Red Herrings. MTF Gamma 6, Deep Feeders. MTF Gamma 13, Asimov's Lawbringers. MTF Delta 5, Front Runners. MTF Epsilon 6, Village Idiots. MTF Epsilon 9, Fire Eaters. MTF Epsilon 11, Nine-Tailed Fox. MTF Zeta 9, Mole Rats. MTF Eta 4, Begone Thoth. MTF Eta 5, Georgia Bombers. MTF Eta 10, See No Evil. MTF Eta 11, Savage Beasts. MTF Theta 4, Gardeners. MTF Theta 90, Angle Grinders. MTF Iota 10, Dam Feds. MTF Kappa 10, Skynet. MTF Lambda 4, Birdwatchers. MTF Lambda 5, White Rabbits. MTF Lambda 12, Pest Control. MTF Lambda 14, 1-star reviewers. MTF Mu 3, Highest bidders. MTF Mu 4, Debuggers. MTF Mu 13, Ghostbusters. MTF Nu 7, Hammer Down. MTF Omicron Rho, The Dream Team. MTF Pi 1 City Slickers. MTF Rho 1, The Professors. MTF Rho 9, Technical Support. MTF Rho 19, Cytherians. MTF Sigma 3, Bibliographers. MTF Sigma 66, 16 tons. MTF TAU 5, Samsara. MTF C7, Home Improvement. MTF C8, The Silencers. MTF Omega 0, Aroran. MTF Omega 7, Pandora's Box. MTF Omega 12, Achilles Heels. MTF Stigma 9, evolved from naturally occurring gears, levers and pulleys. Additional MTFs. Beta 777, Hecate's Spear. Epsilon 7, Forget-Me-Nots. Theta 5, The Bigger Boat. Upsilon 4, Sugar Pill. Phi 2, Clever Girls. Mobile Task Force List. MTF Alpha 1, Red Right Hand. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Alpha 1 is a task force that reports directly to the O5 Council and is used in situations that require the strictest operational security. The task force consists of the Foundation's best and most loyal operatives. Further information regarding MTF Alpha 1 is classified Level 5. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2271. SCP-3434. SCP-3499. SCP-3741. SCP-3791. SCP-4470. SCP-5008. SCP-5105. Action Reports. The High Court with the Magic Army. Null Space. Ledger Domain. Chaos Insurgency Hub. Gate of Janus. MTF Alpha 4. Pony Express. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Alpha 4 consists primarily of personnel trained to act as undercover employees and specialize in tracking, intercepting, and securing anomalous objects sent through postal and package delivery services worldwide. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-111. SCP-130. SCP-360. SCP-2177. SCP-2577. SCP-2752. SCP-3060. SCP-3512. SCP-3601. SCP-4209. MTF Alpha 9. Last Hope. Task Force Mission. The Reborn Omega 7. A mobile task force explicitly intended to train and utilize humanoid SCP objects in the field. Action Reports. The Seed of an Idea. Deals with the Devil. The Wolves at the Door. In Harm's Way. Operation Camp Granada. No Joke. Getting into Trouble. MTF Beta 4. Castaways. Task Force Mission. MTF Beta 4 is a task force created with the sole purpose of assisting and monitoring GOI 466, Wilson's Wildlife Solutions in their interactions with local fauna-based anomalies. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-3465. SCP-3466. SCP-3467. SCP-3577. SCP-3676. SCP-3879. MTF Beta 7. Mazhatters. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Beta 7 specializes in the acquisition and containment of anomalies exhibiting extreme biological, chemical, or radiological hazards, as well as the rapid containment and cleanup of areas affected by such anomalies. This includes the planning and deployment of contingencies for wide area or pandemic spread of anomalous disease agents or other contagious phenomena. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-400, SCP-550, SCP-1280, SCP-1393, SCP-2133, SCP-2376, SCP-2438, SCP-2810, SCP-3016. Action Reports. Operation Camp Granada. A World's Legacy. Lockdown Procedures. MTF Gamma 5. Red Herrings. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Gamma 5 specializes in preventing the dissemination of knowledge of anomalous events or phenomena in cases where initial suppression efforts have proven ineffective or insufficient, or in cases where such knowledge has already reached critical levels of public exposure. This includes the research and deployment of experimental amnestics as well as memory fabrication procedures. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1086, SCP-1110, SCP-1460, SCP-1532, SCP-1548, SCP-1570, SCP-1618, SCP-1670, SCP-2105, SCP-2342, SCP-2631, SCP-3339, SCP-4039, SCP-4160. Action Reports. Project Heimdall. Bigger Than Jesus. Himindjog. Lockdown Procedures. MTF Gamma 6. Deep Feeders. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Gamma 6 specializes in the investigation and tracking of deep-sea or oceanic anomalies. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-169, SCP-879, SCP-1264, SCP-1409, SCP-2120, SCP-2770, SCP-2956, SCP-3069, SCP-6055. Action Reports. Parting. Interlude. Drift. MTF Gamma 13. Asimov's Lawbringers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Gamma 13 specializes in the investigation, tracking, and apprehension of anomalous objects, persons, and entities associated with GOI 1115 Anderson Robotics. This includes identification of Anderson customers, location of Anderson products, and conduction of raids on Anderson offices. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2306, SCP-2806, SCP-2906, SCP-3560. Action Reports. The Elusive Anderson, or Stringers. The Blackbird and the Falcon. Assault on Site 64. MTF Delta 5. Front Runners. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Delta 5 is comprised of multiple autonomous deep cover cells specializing in the identification and preemptive acquisition of anomalous objects and entities of interest to other groups of interest. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-185, SCP-472, SCP-1139, SCP-5071. Action Reports. Hephaestus. Peanuts. MTF Epsilon 6. Village Idiots. Task Force Mission. Specializes in the investigation, containment, and subsequent cleanup of anomalies in rural and suburban environments. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2447, SCP-2480, SCP-2561, SCP-2815, SCP-3322, SCP-3449, SCP-3845, undefined. SCP-4709, SCP-4775, SCP-5000, SCP-6186, MTF Epsilon-9, Fire Eaters. Task Force Mission. Epsilon-9 specializes in the use of incendiary weaponry and operations in high-temperature environments, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-165, SCP-262, SCP-968, SCP-2340, SCP-3205, SCP-4111, MTF Epsilon-11, Nine-Tailed Fox. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Epsilon-11 handles internal security for the SCP Foundation, under oversight by MTF Alpha-1. They are a special ops force deployed to Foundation sites when standard protocols fail and multiple breaches are imminent. As such, most of their operations are classified. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2139, SCP-2479, SCP-3030, SCP-4171, SCP-4511, SCP-5018. Action Reports. Lockdown Procedures. MTF Zeta-9, Mole Rats. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Zeta-9 specializes in the investigation, exploration, and containment of underground or enclosed areas exhibiting anomalous phenomena, particularly those with inconsistent topography or unstable spacetime. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-184, SCP-455, SCP-835, SCP-1162, SCP-1730, SCP-2518, SCP-2591, SCP-2955, SCP-3066, SCP-3512, SCP-3667. Action Reports. Old Routes. Animalia. Experiment Log 914. The Lockdown. Himinjog. Lessons for Old Dogs. The Last Good Man in the Foundation. MTF Eta-4. Begone Thoth. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Eta-4 is a unit of intelligent SCP-3095 affected seabirds. Eta-4 specializes in information collection and analysis, complementary field research and support, and in extreme cases, airborne combat. The task force was ultimately charged with protecting humanity after the B-class migration end of consciousness scenario, assisting in containment of objects. EE-3570, SCP-4688, SCP-5106. Action Reports. Team Bird Hub. Join the Flock. SPC-507. The Sacred Jehuti. Avian Anthology I. Avian Anthology 2. MTF Eta-5. Georgia Bombers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Eta-5 is a rapid response unit specializing in the tracking, capturing, and containment of large-scale aggressors, entities over 30 meters in height. Deploys from, and detains LSAs within Dimensional Site 172. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2764. SCP-3534. SCP-4315. SCP-5391. SCP-5514. Action Reports. War on All Fronts. Hub. LTE 2712 Bosch. Lockdown Procedures. MTF ETA-10. See No Evil. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force ETA-10 specializes in the investigation, acquisition, and initial containment of objects or entities exhibiting visual cognitohazards, visual mimetic agents, or otherwise require indirect or alternative observation in order to safely handle, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-020, SCP-125, SCP-571, SCP-904, SCP-1561, SCP-2136, SCP-2140, SCP-2155, SCP-2828, SCP-3393, SCP-3519, SCP-3597. Action Reports. Experiment Log T-98816 OC-108/682. SCP-1933-X. Lockdown Procedures. MTF ETA-11. Savage Beasts. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force ETA-11 specializes in the investigation, acquisition, and containment of auditory and musical anomalies, including any auditory cognitohazards or sound-based anomalous threats, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1687, SCP-1844, SCP-2402, SCP-2828, SCP-3447, SCP-3519. Action Reports. A Convincing Liar. An Impenitent Thief. Project Proposal 2014-2112. Dreams of Failure. Pattern Breaker. The Musical Suspects. Counterpoint. Lockdown Procedures. MTF Theta-4. Gardeners. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Theta-4 specializes in the acquisition and containment of plant or plant-like anomalous objects and entities, especially fieldwork involving widespread infestations of such anomalies, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-628, SCP-1147, SCP-1255, SCP-1262, SCP-1717, SCP-2108, SCP-3215, SCP-3421, MTF Theta-90, Angle Grinders. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Theta-90 deals with anomalous topologies, geometries, and similar mathematical problem areas, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1707, SCP-3307. Action Reports. Tuesday, 11 a.m. Conference Room 3. Wednesday, 3 p.m. The Office of Paul DiMaxio. Monday, 6 a.m. Escheville Facility 2. Friday, 2200. Paul DiMaxio's Personal Quarters. Mobile Task Force Induction Remarks. MTF IOTA-10. Damn Feds. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force IOTA-10 maintains undercover operatives in various international, federal, and provincial law enforcement agencies and specializes in facilitating the transfer of anomalous evidence and objects into Foundation control as well as the transfer of jurisdiction over anomalous event locations from local law enforcement to Foundation containment and response teams, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-210, SCP-437, SCP-1243, SCP-1359, SCP-2036, SCP-2578, SCP-2890, SCP-2942, SCP-3117, SCP-3155, SCP-3458, SCP-3183, SCP-5617. Action Reports. Project Heimdall. MTF Kappa 10. Skynet. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Kappa 10 is a temporary designation until such time it is either officially dissolved or sanctioned. It is strictly tasked in investigating and engaging cyber anomalies using a combination of virtual agents, AICs, and Foundation researchers to track, neutralize, and/or contain such intangible threats. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2522, SCP-2806, SCP-2987, SCP-3090, SCP-3323, SCP-3959, SCP-4950, SCP-5860. Action Reports. Hello World. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Part 4. Rogue AI. Basic Observations. Himinjog. MTF Lambda 4. Birdwatchers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Lambda 4 specializes in the identification, tracking, and containment of airborne biological anomalies, especially anomalous avian organisms. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-514, SCP-1476, SCP-1505, SCP-1560, SCP-2760, SCP-2967, MTF Lambda 5, White Rabbits. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Lambda 5 specializes in traversing unstable, surreal, and controlled reality, and containing potentially dangerous persons and artifacts capable of manipulating space and time. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2446, SCP-3087. Action Reports. SCP-2446-B4 Interview. Lambda Killer. 2525 North Waterworks Saint. Rabbit here, rabbit there. Lockdown procedures. MTF Lambda 12. Pest Control. Task Force Mission. Specializes in tracking, containing, and exterminating anomalous vermin. Often used as a first response team when tracking anomalous organisms. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2350, SCP-2810, SCP-3470, SCP-3640, SCP-4310, SCP-4749, MTF Lambda 14, 1-star reviewers. Task Force Mission. A task force that specializes in dealing with retail-oriented locations and anomalies, be they singular restaurants or entire shopping districts displaying anomalies. Since their initial investigation of the Ambrose restaurant, MTF Lambda 14 has been assigned to work to combat this group. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-4348, SCP-4554, SCP-5559. Action Reports. Dining Out. The Ambrose Fair. MTF Mu-3. Highest Bidders. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Mu-3 is dedicated to monitoring Goy Marshall, Carter and Dark Limited. Through the combined efforts of undercover agents and covert ops specialists, their objective is identifying objects of interest in possession of Marshall, Carter and Dark, isolating opportunities to recover these objects, and ultimately achieving their containment. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2423, SCP-2463, SCP-2818, SCP-5169. Action Reports. Application to form MTF Mu3. Little Draft Horses. Broker Bailer Grifter Thief. Cover letter for After Action Report. Operation Free Market. MTF Mu4. Debuggers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Mu4 specializes in the identification, tracking, retrieval, and containment of electronic devices and transmissions, especially anomalous computers and network-related anomalies. This includes the investigation of Internet sites suspected of anomalous capabilities or involved in anomalous events. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-155. SCP-892. SCP-896. SCP-1290. SCP-1866. SCP-2160. SCP-2223. SCP-2698. SCP-2738. SCP-2876. SCP-2890. SCP-3030. SCP-3045. SCP-3089. SCP-3101. SCP-3334. SCP-3858. Action Reports. Come Back Kid. T-. MTF Mu-13. Ghostbusters. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Mu-13 specializes in the tracking, analysis, and containment of incorporeal or intangible manifestations and entities, particularly those believed to be sentient, sapient, or otherwise intelligent and adaptive. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-128. SCP-460. SCP-1036. SCP-2227. SCP-3371. SCP-5685. Action Reports. Are we there yet? Tasers and Thermite. Lockdown Procedures. MTF Nu-7. Hammer Down. Task Force Mission. Armed Mobile Task Force Nu-7 is a battalion-strength force consisting of 3 company-sized elements of Special Operations Infantry Forces, a light armored vehicle company, tank platoon, helicopter squadron, chemical biological, radiological nuclear, CBRN, platoon, combat engineer platoon, nuclear weapon specialist, NWS, squad, plus additional combat specialist and support personnel. AMTF Nu-7 is based primarily out of Armed Biocontainment Area 14 and is tasked with responding to incidents involving loss of communication with major Foundation facilities under circumstances wherein a site-wide breach, enemy compromise, or other similarly catastrophic event is suspected. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-939. SCP-1105, SCP-1943, SCP-2128, SCP-2546, SCP-2660, SCP-2706, SCP-2803, SCP-3221. Action Reports. Lockdown Procedures. Aftermath. Operation Camp Granada. MTF Omicron Rho. The Dream Team. Task Force Mission. The Foundation has discovered the method of becoming Oneroi, and now with this power are more capable of containing them. For decades they teach their agents the technique that allows one consciousness to join another's. The few mentally hardened individuals that succeed are organized into a task force. The first of these was Mobile Task Force Omicron Rho. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1394. SCP-2144. SCP-2235. SCP-2603. SCP-2934. SCP-2942. SCP-3060. Action Reports. Zoopania. Black Lotus. Oneirocritic. Oneirochemy. Oneirophrenia. A breath of relief no different from drowning. Lessons for old dogs. MTF Pi-1 City Slickers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Pi-1 specializes in the investigation, containment, and subsequent cleanup of anomalies in densely populated urban environments, particularly in the New York metropolitan area, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-274, SCP-602, SCP-1155, SCP-1219, SCP-1388, SCP-2162, SCP-2409, SCP-2890, SCP-2990, SCP-3335, SCP-3360, SCP-3597, SCP-4051, SCP-5841. Action Reports. Incident 668-A. Dear Cavalier. Job Opportunities. The Consequences of a Deep, Dark Disassociation. MTF Rho 1. The Professors. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Rho 1 specializes in the acquisition, containment, and transport of anomalies related to Group of Interest Alpha 388, Alex Silver University. With the reduction of the threat posed by the specific GOI, the MTF has expanded its focus to any and all containment for anomalous academic endeavors, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-877, SCP-1546, SCP-3138, SCP-4028, SCP-4218. Action Reports. Parable of the Wayward Prince. Commencement. Deontic. Soliloquy. Repel. Negotiation. Denouement and Epilogue. Himinjog. MTF Rho 9. Technical Support. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Rho 9 handles computer security for the Foundation. When mimetic kill agents can lurk throughout the data structure, this is no simple task. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1549, SCP-2234, SCP-4550, SCP-5018. Action Reports. Redzone Red DB Archive Asynchronous Copy Vulnerability. Your first support assignment. Warm Milk and Ramen. Himinjog. MTF Rho 19. Cytherians. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Rho 19 has been sent to Venus, in the hopes to establish a Foundation presence where there may be considerable anomalous activity, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2474. Action Reports. M13 Personnel Memorabilia Log. Volume 19.113. A01. Of the Instruments, Composers, and the Confisci Nabiscum. Planetfall. Exploration Log 2474.1. Labyrinth's End. MTF Sigma 3. Bibliographers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Sigma 3 is charged with exploring, understanding, and eventually containing the vast otherworldly location of the Wanderer's Library, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-472, SCP-1591, SCP-2975, SCP-3591, SCP-6000. Action Reports. Lessons Learned. Site 11. Conference Room K. 8:58 a.m. The 12th of July, 1982. Nothing says promotion like a bag over your head. Making a scene. Magic Orientation. The Conspiracy of Sigma 3. Operation Azure Peregrine. Consolidation. A New Age of Magic. The Beast Beneath the Library. MTF Sigma 66, 16 tons. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Sigma 66 is formed of captured members from other GOI. Despite the lack of loyalty the Foundation expects from the assembled team, they find the members' expertise of value. Action Reports. MTF Sigma 66 Post-Mission Psychological Evaluation. Stick the landing. 2 transcribed conversations in very different tones. A dysfunctional heist. Headache. MTF TAU-5. Samsara. Task Force Mission. Immortal cyborg clones created from the flesh of a dead god. TAU-5 utilizes esoteric and experimental Foundation weaponry to investigate and contain thaumaturgic, magical, and psionic threats, assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1730, SCP-2673, SCP-2621, SCP-2970, SCP-3780. Action Reports. Avatara. Grant request for investigating the application of certain research assets in overcoming inherent limitations of the human body. Operation Azure Peregrine. The Lord of Endowments. Samsara. Deus Vulture. A thin dangerous line. Death Perception. The Powers That Bark. MTF-C7. Home Improvement. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force C7 specializes in the undercover investigation, containment, and/or demolition of anomalous buildings or buildings affected by anomalies, particularly residential homes in populated areas. This includes the acquisition or transfer of affected buildings to Foundation control as well as initial observation and documentation of such buildings prior to transfer to local containment teams for long-term or ongoing containment. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-574, SCP-744, SCP-1452, SCP-1684, SCP-1967, SCP-2215, SCP-2281, SCP-2311, SCP-2407, SCP-2426, SCP-2490, SCP-2891, SCP-2975, SCP-3050. Action Reports. Overview of MTF-C7 Home Improvement. Contingency. The Beast Beneath the Library. MTF-C8. The Silencers. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force C8 specializes in the investigation, tracking, containment and/or destruction of individuals suspected to be capable of or having been affected by reanimation anomalies, as well as investigating suspected cases of communication with deceased individuals. This includes the severing of devices intended to allow communication with individuals buried alive, such as bells, pipes, and phones, as well as detainment and interrogation of individuals claiming to have had contact with deceased individuals. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-565, SCP-2158, SCP-2922, SCP-3591, SCP-3914, SCP-4175. Action Reports. SCP-231-J. MTF Omega-0. Aroran. Task Force Mission. The Saints of MTF Omega-0 are informational constructs with the memories of deceased Foundation personnel able to manifest through access of the Foundation's intranet terminals. Using identity warfare training, IWT, they protect their living comrades against informational threats and entities. The existence of MTF Greek letter Omega-0 is unknown to most or all of the living members of the Foundation. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-1463, SCP-2111, SCP-2759, SCP-3664. Action Reports. In the trenches with the dead. Mature-minded. Your last first day. Personal log of Richard Lorenz. A thin dangerous line. MTF Omega-7. Pandora's Box. Task Force Mission. Mobile Task Force Omega-7 has been disbanded and decommissioned. This entry is to be deleted by order of the Records and Information Security Administration. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-175. SCP-354. Action Reports. Incident Log. Personal Log of Agent A. Incident 0. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Part 4. Part 5. MTF Omega-12. Achilles Heels. Task Force Mission. A task force composed of reality-bending Foundation personnel from an alternate universe. Omega-12 is tasked with capturing SCP-3480-2 instances, guarding the many entities imprisoned in Area 13, and hunting down powerful uncontained reality benders elsewhere. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-3480. SCP-3221. SCP-3155. SCP-3797 ARC. SCP-4455. Action Reports. On the Slope of Olympus. SCP-3301 Testing Log 012. MTF Stigma 9. Evolved from naturally occurring gears, levers and pulleys. Task Force Mission. Historically, the Church of the Broken God had always prided itself on its artificiality, that its faith is proven with tangible artifacts and physical devices of miracles. So, when the time came to destabilize the Church, the Foundation put forth a team of forgers, and Stigma 9 was it. Assisting in containment of objects. SCP-2834. SCP-3341. SCP-3221. SCP-5862. Action Reports. Broken Faith. Operation Hippodrome. Recording Hippodrome 045. Additional MTFs. All MTFs not meeting the requirements necessary to receive its own entry with UT may be placed here. The list here should in no way be construed to be exhaustive. New MTFs are formed and disbanded all the time as the Foundation requires. If you're looking for an MTF to use, this list may be of assistance. MTFs seeing use in multiple articles may be added to this list upon request. Beta 777. Hecate's Spear. Task Force Mission. Specializes in thaumaturgical ritual analysis and countermeasures, including thaumaturgical combat. Encounters. SCP-3743. SCP-4612. SCP-4712. SCP-5079. SCP-5512. SCP-5923. SCP-5957. Epsilon 7. Forget-me-nots. Task Force Mission. Undercover Task Force tasked with disrupting the research and development of amnestic drugs. Encounters. SCP-2111. SCP-2358. SCP-2438. SCP-2828. Theta 5. The Bigger Boat. Task Force Mission. Specialized in anomalies involving or threatening marine vehicles. Encounters. SCP-2162. SCP-1568. SCP-1373. SCP-1409. SCP-3057. Upsilon 4. Sugar Pill. Task Force Mission. Originally formed in order to contain SCP-2559. Mobile Task Force Upsilon 4 is tasked with epidemiological containment, especially with the containment of mimetic outbreaks. Encounters. SCP-2350. SCP-2559, SCP-2546, SCP-3519. Phi-2. Clever Girls. Task Force Mission. Task Force specializing in study, tracking, capture, and hunting of prehistoric anomalies, especially dinosaurs. Encounters. SCP-3057, SCP-3934, SCP-3467, SCP-4041.